Okay. I'm recording now. As usual, feel free to interrupt me at any point if you have questions or you want me to go over something again. What we're going to be doing today is adding a little bit more CSS to our website project. So I'm going to be going back to replit.com to continue working there. So I'm going to stream my browser. And I'm going to go to replit.com and I'm going to go to my REPLs and go to my MMP 100 folder. So last week we did our HTML basics. On Tuesday we did our CSS basics, color and typography. I'm going to duplicate this actually, and what we're going to add today is some layout. And with CSS, layout is quite complicated, so we're just going to go over a few basics. It would really take a long time to cover everything, but I'll go over just a few basic things that you guys may want to use to lay out your choose your own adventure project. So I'm going to click on fork and make a copy of this. And that's going to create a new project here, and I'll share a link to this in the voice chat. So that link will stay the same. I'm going to make some edits, but when you go there, you'll see those edits. And if you want to fork the project, you can. Let's get started. So here's my website. So one of the things that you'll notice with the website I've created so far, I added some colors, I added some typography, some pretty simple stuff on Tuesday. But the website, everything just kind of like goes in a line from the top of the page to the bottom of the page. There's no real layout going on. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to go over to my CSS page. I'll leave these comments here, but I'm going to add to this a little bit. So layout. So there's three things that we're going to cover today. One is the box model, and I'll explain what this means very shortly. Actually, before we even get there, we have to talk about block versus inline. Then we're going to talk about the box model. Then, after we talk about the box model, we're going to talk about containers. And then we're going to talk about layout, grid, and flex layout. So there's a few different topics. All of them are actually quite involved. So we're going to kind of briefly touch on them. But it'll give you enough to be able to update your website in a way to I'm going to open up my web preview in a new tab by clicking on this little arrow button over here. And I'm going to go and open up the elements page, which I can do. I'm on Windows, so I can actually do this by just holding Control-Shift and I. And it means inspect, and that's going to show me the elements section. You can also click on the menu and go to more tools and go to developer tools. That's for Chrome. You can also right-click and go to inspect on Chrome or other browsers. Some browsers have different versions of this. If you're not sure how to do that, we can go over it later. But I want to have this inspector open here so I can take a look at what my layout looks like, and I can also make some changes to what's going on in my project. So let's talk first about block versus inline. So on an HTML page, if we look at the content that we've got so far, you'll notice that my content just goes from the top of the bottom, and each section that I put in just creates a new line on the page. This is called HTML flow. This basically just means that we start at the top and then we keep going down to the bottom as we add new content. And there's two default types of layout in HTML. One is block, and block means it takes up the whole page. So most of my basic elements are block. This H1 is block. You can see that even though the text only takes up this area, the block itself, the H1, spreads out to fill out the whole page. Paragraphs are also default to block. So you can see down here in my inspector where it says paragraph, the display is block. that is the user agent style sheet. That is the default styles. That's not a style that I wrote in my own CSS page. So the paragraph is block, a list is block, and HR is block. This paragraph is block. Here's an example of an inline element. This image here is not block. This image is inline. So if we look in the default, it actually doesn't have a default, but the default for any thing is going to be inline. This BR tag doesn't have anything, but it's separating my image from my anchor tag. So that's the first thing I'm going to do actually is I'm going to delete these break tags that I used before because I don't need them anymore. I'm going to be able to do some styling with CSS. So I'm going to go back to my index.html and I'm just going to delete these break tags. And you'll see what changes in the layout when I'm done here. So if I refresh this page, now notice my images and my anchor tags, my links, are sitting next to each other. This is what inline styles are. So if a anchor tag or an image is just by itself, it's inline, meaning that stuff can stack up next to it. So most tags default to block. Some tags default to inline. The reason that anchor tags are inline is because they're often part of another piece of content, like a paragraph or a list. So if I had an anchor tag inside of my list item, like I have here, I wouldn't want it to make an extra section there. I would just want to have the list item. If I had a paragraph with an anchor tag inside of it, I would want that link to stay inside of the paragraph. So for example, if I wanted to link Woods to something, I could put an A here. And I'm just going to put a little default here so it'll just show up, but it won't actually go anywhere. Now you can see that Woods link. So because the anchor tag is inline, it doesn't break up the content. If I change that, if I change the display to block, now it's breaking up all that content. So that's not what we want for an anchor tag because we often have anchor tags embedded inside of paragraphs or list items or other components in our HTML. So that's the difference between inline and block. Block takes up the full width of the page. Inline is just the content. It doesn't go outside of the content. So that's inline versus block display. And the way we set that is just using the display attribute. So for example, if I wanted my list items, I have these like two list items here. Let's say I wanted them to sit next to each other instead of taking up their own blocks. I could say li for list item and make a new CSS. And I could say display is inline. And when I save this, now my links are next to each other. It also breaks the list a little bit, but that's okay for this demonstration. Now the list items are sitting next to each other because they're in line instead of block. And there's also a middle ground, which is inline dash block. And what this does is they're still in line, but I can apply my box model. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is the box model. And there's good websites for all of this stuff. If you Google any of this stuff like CSS inline versus block, you'll get some good examples. Let's see if we can find a CSS tricks example because they're usually the best. Okay, I'm just going to put it in my search. Okay, so they call it display. So, there's a million tutorials that explain how this stuff works in way, way more depth than what we have time to cover in class. I'm going to put in parentheses display here. Okay, we're probably not going to need to use these rules. We're probably just going to use the defaults, but I'm just explaining how everything fits together. So next is the box model. Box model only applies to block elements or inline block. So I'm going to put a note here. What the box model is spacing that we add around our content. And we can see that when I click on one of my elements, the preview up here in in the Chrome developer window, those orange bars, the blue bar in the middle on the H1 there where it says my website, that's the block of the content. The orange bars represent the margin. So it's the margin between the rest of the content on the page, so it spaces out the page. So if I took that margin out, if I said margin is 0, that spacing goes away. So that's part of the box model. And there's 4 parts in the box model. There's the content, which is like the middle. Let's see. Usually CSS tricks is like the first thing that comes up, but I'm just gonna put it in here. Okay, so here's the box model. So we have the content, then we have the padding, which is the space between the content and the box. Then we have the border, where we can make an outline around the box. And then we have the margin, which spaces from the outline outward. So it gives us a lot of options for how to do some styling. So let's demonstrate that with our H1. So we can't see it right now because the H1 by default doesn't have a border, but I'm going to give this element a border. I'm going to say border, and then this one is a weird one because with CSS, sometimes we can put a bunch of rules together. So for the border, I'm going to say it's 2 pixels wide. It's solid, meaning it's just a line. And I'm going to use that orange color that I used for my other stuff. Let's make it even bigger. Let's make it 4 pixels. So sometimes with CSS rules, we can combine a few rules. There's no real logic to this. It's another one of those weird CSS things where you just kind of have to memorize stuff. But if I open this little thing here, you can see all of the border rules. There's a million of them. What I'm really saying with this line of code is I'm saying border dash style is solid, border dash color is orange, and border dash width is 4 pixels. So one of the things that's nice about CSS is we can combine 3 rules into one. The problem is you just have to memorize, you just have to know what the order is here, or you can look it up. But there's no real logic to the order of these. It's just how it's set up. But most of the time you'll see something that looks like this: border, 4 pixels, solid, orange. So let's put that in our style sheet. For our H1, I'm going to say border is 4 pixels, solid line, and it's orange. There's some other like things you can use besides solid. Like if I say dotted, something like that, I get different effects, or like dashed or double. You can do different stuff with it. I'm just going to stick with solid for today. So the border will help us see the rest of the box model. So you can see the orange margins at the top and the bottom. Then if we put padding in here, so if I say padding, and let's say it's 16 pixels, notice that what that did is it made space in between the outline and the content. So now, if we look at this, the content is the blue section. The padding is this sort of green section between the content and the margin, or the border. And then the border is the border. It's whatever color we give it. It's visible. And then the margin is the space between the content and the outside. So the default margin for an H1 is a little bit at the top and a little bit at the bottom. But we can set the margin for the whole thing by saying something like that. Margin is 16 pixels. So both margin and padding have another combined rule where we're actually setting the top, right, left, top, right, bottom, and left values of the margin. So that's where CSS also gets pretty confusing, because I can separate these. I could say padding on the left is, well, actually, we're not going to be able to see that. So I could say something like margin on the left is 64 pixels, and I can set one rule that overwrites the rules that came before it. This is something I don't think we're going to use, but it's good to be aware of that. So let's write this in. We're gonna say our margin is 16 pixels, which is really 1 EM. So I'm going to use 1 EM there, and padding is 1 EM. Okay, so our box model consists of the content, which is in the middle, our padding, which is between the border and the content, the border itself around the block, and then the margin that is set between the border and the rest of the page. So there's a lot there. It takes a while to get used to it. We don't really have a lot of time to like go into lots of specifics, but that's kind of the basic idea behind the box model. And again, that applies only to like block style elements. And so we'll use that again in a second. But next, what we're going to do is look at containers. And before we look at containers, I'm going to give you an example of layout because it's going to make containers make a little bit more sense. So what I'm going to do, we have this section here where we have welcome to my website. Then we have like a little list and these list items. And what I could do, let's say I wanted to put these all in one line. So I have a more like a header part of my website. I can use something called the flex box for this. A flex box is a way to lay out elements across the page instead of down the page. And so this is a CSS rule that I can apply to any element. The problem is that if I take my paragraph and I say display is flex, it doesn't really do anything. And if I take my unordered list and say display is flex, well, that actually sets my links next to each other, but it doesn't do anything to my paragraph and my unordered list. And so this is where containers become useful. I'm going to delete this rule for a second. So if I want two elements to sit next to each other, I need them to be in the same container. So we can create containers using an element called the div, which is short for division. It's like a division of the page. And it comes from like layout, like magazine layout, where you have like different panels. But obviously now everything is on the web. We have different parts of our website. And so what I can do is I can put my paragraph and my list. I can put both of those guys into a separate container, and I can style that container rather than the list itself. So the way I can do that, I'm going to go back to my index page for a second. So this is an HTML thing that works with our CSS. So I want to separate out this section of my website and put it into a little container. So I'm going to make a div, and a div is basically just an empty element where I can put more elements inside of it. So I'm going to take a div, I'm going to cut my paragraph and paste it in, and then I'm going to cut my unordered list and paste it in here. And I'm just going to move these list items over, and I'm going to move this unordered list over. Now look, I have this div here, and if I collapse this, all of that content is now inside its own area. And div, again, is just a default element. It stands for division. If we hover over it, actually, we can see what it says. The div element has no special meaning at all. It represents its children, blah, blah, blah. There's other specific types of divs. Like I could call this a header section. You might see that a lot. A header is like a specific type of div. Wait, where did my, oh, that's over here. Let's put a couple of notes here. Okay, so containers are usually div element, but we have specific containers like header, nav, footer. There's a main div where we can put our main content. There's section, if we have like a section. There's a bunch of other ones. Those are just a few. So I'm going to say that this is my header section. So now the cool thing about that is now I have this header section that represents more than one piece of content, and I can set the display on that header section instead of the individual elements. So I can say display is flex, and now my elements will sit next to each other. And I can say things about how I want this to work. So if we go to CSS tricks, Flexbox, the Flexbox is actually super complicated, but it's going to be really useful for just this menu area. But basically, we can set the relationship between the different boxes in a Flexbox. And the one that I want to look at here is the justify content rule. This basically says how the content is laid out. So you can have it just at the start, which is what the default is. You can see we have inside the header, we have the paragraph, and then we have the list. And they're just sitting right next to each other. That's the default flex start. Flex end, we move everything to the end. we center everything. Space between spreads everything out. That's probably what I'm going to use. Space around has the same amount of space around each one, and space evenly spreads them out. It distributes them across the space. So I'm going to take a look at what this looks like if I say justify content, and I'm going to say, where is it? Spread, wait, what did I want? I wanted space between. Okay, so if I do space between, now it has my welcome paragraph and then my list over here. Okay, so let's add those rules. I'm going to go back to style.css. I'm going to use header as my selector, and I'm going to say display is flex. Okay. So, and then I'm going to add justify content, and Replic's going to help me here because it knows what the different rules are. So I'm going to say space around, or is that what I wanted? No, I wanted space between. Okay. So a couple of more things that I might want to fix here. So I have this list here. It's got some default styling. You can see it's got some padding on the left. It's got these little dots. I might not really want that. That's not really how we kind of tend to do stuff now. So I could take my list and I could say, you know what, I don't need this margin anymore. I'll set the margin to 0. I don't need the padding anymore. I want that to be 0. But then I might not want it to be right next to the edge of the website. So I could say something like padding to the right is 1 EM. We'll get a little space there. And then if I don't like my list elements, I could take my LI and just say text decoration is, no, it's not text decoration. What is it? Decoration. Oh, no, it's list style. List style is none. That'll get rid of my dots. Okay, so let's add that in there. So I'm going to say UL margin, and this is really just like undoing some of the defaults of CSS. Margin is 0, padding is 0. So I'm just using the UL selector, making a new rule. Margin is 0, padding is 0, and let's see what that looks like. Okay, then I'm going to get rid of those dots. You can leave the dots if you want, but I'm going to get rid of them. I'm going to say for my list item, I want the list style to be none. So now we won't have these dots over there. And then we might want a little bit of a margin or a padding. So actually, let's just add this to our header. Let's say the padding is 0, 1 EM. This is another way to write padding. I'll show you guys what this looks like. So another thing that you can do with padding and other box model elements is if you want to do something for the same as the top and bottom and right left, you can just do 2 rules. The first is the top and bottom, the second is the right and left. So if I say padding is 0 and then 1 EM, you can see that what that actually means is padding top 0, padding right 1, padding bottom 0, padding left 1. Okay, so that's pretty simple. Okay, a lot of information, but that's, those are some of the CSS basics. Okay, let's see. It still looks a little weird. Let's see if I need to set the vertical align center. I'm not going to worry about it. This is basics. I'm not going to go over everything. Okay, so we just have one more thing to go over. So far we have learned about block versus inline. We've learned about the box model. We learned how to make a container. And now the last thing, and we also learned about flex layout. So we have one more thing to learn about, which is the grid layout. Grid layout is how most websites are laid out. If you look at any website, I'm going to use the New York Times again. You can see there's a grid. And what a grid is basically just like an organization of squares, really. If we just Google grid and look at some images, you can see a grid is just a layout for a design that has columns. Those are the lines going across, and rows, the lines going down the page. And most designs are done with a grid. It's an easy way to set content in different places. So the New York Times has a grid. It's a little bit more of a complicated grid, like not every cell is exactly the same size, But if we broke this down and looked at it, we can see that, there's like 3 columns going across. Sometimes there's smaller columns inside of a section, but they have a basic grid layout that determines where everything is going to fit. So on our website, right now, our main part of our content, where we have our images and our text, looks pretty weird, right? Because basically, the images are spread out and they're not really designed very well, and it just kind of looks weird. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use another container, and then I'm going to set it up so that the image and the text sit on top of each other using a basic grid. And you can set it up different ways. You don't have to do it exactly like this. But this is going to take a few rules. So we're going to have to adjust a few different things. But we'll go through it, and it's going to look a lot better at the end. So I'm going to go back to my CSS or to my HTML page. And so here's all of my content here. And I want to stick that into a grid. I'm going to get rid of my HR here. I don't really need that anymore. So I'm going to have the paragraph up here by itself. And then I'm going to have a grid for the main part of my story. So I'm going to say main here. And then I'm going to delete this one that Replit made for me. I'm going to move these guys over so they show up, so it looks like they're in the right place. And I'm going to say main here. But I'm going to make an even more complicated setup. So I'm going to start by just saying main. And so that is going to give me some control over where everything is. But what I really want is my image and my text, and then my image and my text. So I'm going to use an even further way of organizing my content by creating a div here. So I'm going to make another div here and put the first image and link in that div. And I'm going to make another div here, and I'm going to put the second image and the second link inside that div. For your story, if you want to have more than 2 options at any point, you can just keep adding more divs, or you could experiment with different layouts. But doing this, now I have my content organized not just into the main section where I have my main content. I now also have, let's reload this page. So I have my main section, but now I also have 2 divs. So notice that the first div is organizing that first set of content. The second div is organizing that second bit of content. So that makes things a lot easier. So we're going to make a couple more changes. So with my div, since the divs are not generic parts like the header or the main, something that I need to do so I can find these divs in my CSS, because there might be lots of divs on my page, is I'm going to give them what's called the class attribute. A class is just a name that we give to a specific element so that we can find it in our CSS, that we can have multiple versions of it. So just like you have a class of students or a class of some type of thing, we're going to have a class of our images and links. I'm going to give this a class. The attribute is just the word class, equals, quotation marks, and then I can name it whatever I want. It doesn't really matter, but I'm going to call this choice. So this is one of the choices in the story. So I'll add the same class down here to this second div. And so now when I go over to my CSS, I'm going to scroll down a little bit. I'm going to add some more styles. So first I'll start with the main section. I'm going to put some styles in there. But then if I want to get the choice, I'm going to say div.choice. So div is the element, then dot stands for class, and choice is the class that I'm going to select. Okay, so let's start with our main. I'm just going to do a really simple thing here. I'm going to say display is grid. And now I just need to tell the how many columns I want. So I'm going to say grid template columns. And I'm just going to say I have to give it 2 columns. So I'm going to say 1 FR, 1 FR. This is a weird one, but FR just means fractional unit. So it's just going to give one section to both of these. So let's refresh that. So now we have our choices sitting next to each other. So we have this first grid. So our main section now has a grid with 2 columns. And if I could change, I can change these values. You'll see what happens if I increase 1. See how it gives more. So if I say 2FR, it gives that one more of the width of the grid. If I keep going up, it does that. And I can add more columns. I don't have more content, but if I had more columns, I would just add another FR over here, and I can keep adding them. I can have as many columns as I need for my story. So now I've got my 2 elements sitting next to each other in a grid. The next part, I'm going to make another grid in my choices. So my choices can actually have their own grid, which is pretty cool. So for my div.choice, I'm going to say display is grid. And this time I'm going to have just a 2-item grid. So I'm going to say grid template rows. And I'm going to do the same thing. Actually, I think this is different, but let's see how that looks. Oh, no, that worked. There we go. Okay. So now I have my main grid is the 2 sections, and then each section has their own separate grid. And you can see that the grid sizes all match. So the image over here, since it takes up that much space, is going to match the image down here. So we're going to add one more rule, and then we'll be done. We're just going to match the size of these images to fit in our grid. So I'm going to go back to my HTML. I'm going to delete this width attribute. I don't need this anymore because I can use CSS. So last week we added the width so that the image wouldn't be too big, but I can use CSS to do this now. So I'm just going to delete those. So our images are really big by default, but we can shrink them down by setting the height. We can do this with width or height. I'm going to use height here, and you'll see why in a second. So now I'm going to say div.choice. Let's put a little comment here that says class selector. And down here, I'm going to put a thing that says, this is called a nested selector. Nested means one thing is inside of another. And the nested selector is just a space, so it's kind of hard to tell what's going on, but it's literally just the thing we want and then a space and then the thing that's inside of it. So our div.choice has an image inside, so we can select that image using a nested selector. And the reason this is really useful is because it's not going to apply to other images that we may have on our page. It's only going to apply to images inside of a choice div. Okay, so I'll write that here. Select only images inside a dot choice or a div dot choice. Okay, I know this is a lot of info, but we're just going to set this up so you guys can use this as a template. And if you want to make modifications, hopefully you'll be able to. So I'm just going to set the height to 100%. This is going to stretch the height of the image to match the size of the div. Okay, it didn't work. Oh, I think I have to set, I think there's a couple things I have. Oh, no, I need to set actually, okay, I can't set the rows based on a fractional unit. I have to set them based on pixels. So I have to say, let's say I want my image to be 200 pixels tall, and my text can be 50 pixels. Or actually, it doesn't really matter. I'll just do 1FR. There we go. That's what I forgot to do before. So we can set a height for the image, and then we just have a leftover, whatever left over is the, say 200 pixels. And then whatever is left over is going to be the text. So the first row is 200 pixels. We can use whatever regular units we want for our grids as well. So that makes the images pretty small. So let's center them. I'm just going to say div.choice text align is center. And then image text align is center. That doesn't work. Maybe I need to say margin is 0. Okay. Okay, so the last little fix I have to do, we're going to say text align. And these are options. Manisha, are you asking a question, or is that just your Maisha, can you mute your audio? I think I can hear you talking.
Oh shit.
Okay, no problem. Okay. So again, you don't have to do text align and center. I am just setting up something simple. You can change the design if you want, of course. I'm going to make the images a little bit bigger. We have a little bit more space. And so then to center the images, remember when I did this weird thing with the padding, where I said the padding top and bottom is 0 and 1 EM for the left and right? I'm going to do something similar with my images, but with the margin. I'm going to say the margin is 0 on the top and bottom, and then auto on the left and right. This is a really easy way to center some content that isn't text, because basically it's just going to divide up the margins on either side of the image. Okay, so there we go. We now have a little bit of a layout. I know that was a lot of information, but I wanted to kind of cover a few different aspects of how we can do layout. So we have our main section is a grid, and it just has 2 parts. One FR just means that it divides the parts evenly on the page. Then we have our choices. So each choice has its own div with the class choice. So we can apply the same rules to each div just by writing it once. We don't have to write the rules over. Inside those divs, we have an image, which is the first row, and then we have an anchor tag, which is the second row. And both are centered, but one is text, so we use text align center for that. And one is an image, so we actually have to set the image div or the image element to have 0 top and bottom margin, and then automatic right and left margin. So there we go. That is our basic layout. One thing that's bothering me is that the paragraph is like on the outside of the header. So let's just go ahead and add the same padding for our paragraph. That still looks weird. Oh, I put the padding. Oh, because there's a paragraph inside of my thing. Okay, let's change this. Okay, so that's a good example of, if there's a paragraph here and there's a paragraph here, if I add a rule to this paragraph, it's going to add a rule to this paragraph. So actually, let's cover one more thing. We already talked about classes. Let's talk about IDs. So class is for a group of things where you have multiple ones. IDs is for one thing that you only have one of on the page. So what I'm going to do with my paragraph is I'm going to assign it an ID. I'm just going to call this message. So this is like the intro message to the story. So now, if I want to get that message, what I can say is paragraph hashtag message. Hashtag stands for ID. So I'll put a note here. Okay, so paragraph hashtag message, now I'll say the padding is 0, 1 EM. And now that's just going to apply to the one paragraph that I have, not to all of the paragraphs on the site. And so it's still not lined up. So let's see why. Okay, my header is padding 1 EM. My paragraph is padding 1 EM. Oh, but my font size is 2 EM on my paragraph. So 1 EM is actually becoming 2 EM. So I can actually just use REM. There we go. REM is the root thing. CSS is really ridiculous. Part of what's hard about learning CSS is that there's a million rules and units, and you only learn it by just like doing it a lot. But REM stands for root M, which is like the original root font size rather than this like 2EM that I added to the paragraph font size. Okay, probably not really that necessary to learn, but there we go. So again, your layout doesn't have to look like this, but these are just like a few basic things that you can do to create a simple layout. And then one problem here is that because this is CSS, but we're combining with HTML elements, I'm going to have to update my other pages because I have these containers and stuff now. So we're going to have to update the content a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I won't do this for all of the pages. I'll just do an example for a couple. So I have forest left. And so I just have to update it so that they match here. And you could just like, you know, redo it, whatever. But basically, I have to make sure that this part is inside the header section. So I'm going to put a header, oops, section here. I'm going to cut that and paste it. I'm going to just click this format button so Replit will format it for me. Okay, so now the header section is set up correctly. And then I'm just going to delete this HR. And then I'm going to add this paragraph up here. Oops. Actually, I'm just going to delete this image because I didn't actually fill out this page yet. I'm going to add the paragraph up here, say ID equals message. And so that'll get me to the point of where I left off. Of course, in this version, I have the image in the background using CSS. Again, you don't have to do that, but that is an option if you want to do that. I haven't added the options in here yet, so that's what I would do next. I would make a main section, and I'd probably just copy and paste this whole section over here, and then add that to the rest of it. Okay, so I know that's a lot of new info. I'm going to stop here and give you guys some time to take a look at this. Keep in mind, you can fork this project. So if you click on the link that I put in the voice chat, you'll be able to see all that code that I just wrote. And if you fork it, you make a copy of it. You can move your content over there and make adjustments, change the colors or the layout, or do whatever you want from there. So it is really quick, but the semester is short and we have a lot of stuff to cover. So there's a lot more to CSS. You will learn it in a lot more depth in later classes. One of the things about MMP 100 is that we're just kind of like touching on these different topics because there's a lot of other ways that you guys will end up concentrating in different things. So some of you guys are probably animation majors. You're going to do more animation and less of the web stuff in your later classes. Some of you guys may be design majors. You're going to do more Illustrator and Photoshop stuff later. Some of you guys are programming majors. You'll work more with HTML and CSS in the future. So the classes that kind of come after this one will go into a lot more detail about this stuff. This is more of just a brief overview to give you guys a sense of what's possible, so that you can kind of have a sense of what you'll be doing in those other courses. So that's just to say, if it feels really like a crazy amount of information to learn at once, I'm not expecting you to memorize everything immediately. We're just kind of going through a little bit of an overview of what you can do. So anyway, I'll post this video and give you guys the rest of the time to play around with this stuff and work on it. If you have ideas for things that you want to do that I didn't cover, let me know. If I think it's something that we could figure out together in class, we could go over it. If I think it's like too complicated, I'll probably just say like that's too hard. Like just focus on the basics. But you can let me know, and we could talk about it to see if we want to do it. Anyway, I'm going to stop the video.